As some of you already know, my name is Dalio, and I have been a global investor for over 50 years. During this time, I have learned that the most impactful surprises in life, the ones that truly alter the course of history, often come from events that had never occurred in our own lifetimes but have repeated themselves throughout history. Today, I want to share with you my personal and profound reflection on what we are experiencing, how history repeats itself, and why I believe what lies ahead could be even worse than a recession. I vividly remember that August 15th, 1971, when I was just a young employee working on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. It was on that day that President Nixon appeared on television and announced that the dollar, which until then had been backed by gold, could no longer be converted into that precious metal. That news shocked me deeply. I had worked in financial markets and was preparing for the stock market to crash, yet prices soared instead. It was a moment when I understood that history, despite its apparent ruptures, repeats certain patterns cyclically. Something similar happened in March 1933, when President Roosevelt made radical decisions during the Great Depression. Though I lived in very different times, those actions made me realize that, in many cases, history reinvents itself. What I have observed is that there are three major forces or processes at play in our era, and together, they are shaping a scenario that could prove problematic for the future. First, we have the massive creation of debt and the printing of money to finance that debt. For decades, governments and central banks have resorted to these policies in response to economic crises, intending to stimulate growth or prevent financial collapse. However, this process has very profound side effects. It causes inflation, erodes the value of money, and distorts financial markets. Second, we live in a time when internal conflict is reaching concerning levels. Social polarization has intensified to the point where irreconcilable differences exist in almost every sphere, from politics to culture, including how we conceive justice and equity. This internal imbalance not only generates social tensions, but also risks the very stability of our economic and political systems. The third force is the rise of a great power challenging the hegemonic power that, for a long time, dictated the rules of the game. China's rapid ascent in recent decades is a clear example of this. In 1945, the world order was established in a way that sustained the growth of Western economies and maintained global equilibrium. Today, that same order is being questioned by the strength of a country that, with exponential economic and military growth, is ready to change the game. To understand how these three forces intertwine, I had to immerse myself in 500 years of history, learning from the rise and fall of empires, how once dominant currencies were born and died, and the evolution of debt. This has helped me grasp what we are experiencing today. For example, what happened during the Great Depression or the 2008 financial crisis feels similar to what we see now. Had I not delved deeply into those past episodes, I would never have been able to imagine the scale of the crisis we face today. The curious thing about our era is that, despite being hyper-connected and having information at our fingertips, many of us have not firsthand experienced those extreme moments that were once part of daily life: wars, brutal recessions, and radical economic shifts. This disconnect makes us vulnerable because, without direct experience, it is hard to prepare for the enormous changes ahead. Now, let me tell you a bit more about how these forces relate to each other and what we might expect in the future, simply and without unnecessary complications. The massive creation of debt and money printing. In recent decades, we have seen firsthand how debt and money printing have been used as quick fixes to stimulate the economy, from the 2008 crisis to the COVID-19 pandemic. Governments and central banks have relied on these strategies to prevent total collapse and keep money circulating. I myself have been at the center of major decisions in truly uncertain times, and I'll tell you plainly, there is no easy way to reverse these processes without painful consequences. When money is printed recklessly, a flood of cash is injected into the economy in the hope that everything will grow, but the secret lies in finding the right balance. If too much is printed without real growth and production, inflation results, meaning our money becomes worth less and instability follows. The world has seen periods where inflation skyrocketed, and to curb it, harsh measures like spending cuts had to be implemented, often leading to even more problems and social unrest. On the other hand, debt is a double-edged sword. Sure, it can finance projects and investments that drive growth, but when it accumulates uncontrollably, it becomes dangerous. Imagine debt as a loan that, if unchecked, turns into a snowball. Excessive debt can create bubbles that, when they burst, leave behind devastating economic crises. One example I always recall is the 2007 housing bubble, where so much debt was accumulated by assets that, when it burst, it triggered a global crisis with effects that linger for years. The key to understanding all this is seeing it as a cycle. In good times, people and businesses take on debt to seize opportunities and grow. But there comes a point when this can no longer continue, when central banks can't lower interest rates further, or when the debt becomes unbearable. Then comes a downturn where debt must be reduced. This adjustment, though necessary, is very painful. The economy slows, activity stagnates, and a recession, or even a depression, unfolds. This is where the past comes into play. The Great Depression of the 1930s, the 2008 crisis, and other historical episodes teach us that when more credit is accumulated than the economy can sustain, the system becomes unbalanced. And once that critical point is reached, the consequences are inevitable. Internal conflict and social polarization. Another aspect that deeply concerns me is the rise of internal conflict and social polarization. Today, differences in values and wealth inequality have become more pronounced than ever. This is not new, but what has changed is how quickly and intensely these tensions surface. Whether in politics, economics, or culture, people are grouping into opposing factions. In the past, when disagreements arose, people could sit down and talk to find common ground. But now, everything seems to turn into a battle of interests with no room for dialogue. These divisions can tear entire communities apart. One key issue is that, in many countries, the system has favored a small group while leaving the rest behind. This imbalance breeds resentment, fueling a cycle of distrust and confrontation. For example, recent studies show that the top 1% of the U.S. population controls nearly 40% of the country's total wealth. That figure shocks me because behind that number are real lives and lost opportunities, something I can't ignore. These aren't just statistics. They represent the reality of millions who lack access to the same opportunities. Personally, I believe a country becomes truly prosperous when all its citizens have the chance to thrive. It's not just about having giants like Google or Tesla, but creating an environment with real justice and opportunity for everyone. Wealth inequality, measured by concentration, is a loud wake-up call. It tells us something isn't working as it should, and that we urgently need to rethink how we distribute the fruits of growth. History has shown us that when economic and social disparities grow too large, the risk of internal conflict skyrockets. It's essential to foster a sense of community by investing in education and infrastructure so people feel part of something and can grow together. To me, this is the foundation for preventing our societies from fragmenting and falling into conflicts that could cost us all dearly. The birth of a new world order. If there's one thing truly reshaping the world right now, it's the rise of China as a superpower. And it's not just economic growth. It's a complete transformation of the game where the U.S. was once the undisputed king. Think about it. After World War II, the U.S. established the rules of the world as we know it today. The dollar became the global reserve currency. Institutions like the IMF and World Bank were created, and free trade was promoted under terms that favored the West. For a long time, this ensured stable growth and a kind of global order. But nothing lasts forever, and in recent decades, we've seen the system begin to wobble. China has gone from being a mostly rural and backward country to becoming the world's factory. It doesn't just produce everything from iPhones to electric cars. It has also gained influence in strategic sectors like technology, artificial intelligence, and even space exploration. The most impressive thing is the speed at which it has achieved this. In the 1980s, China's economy represented less than 2% of global GDP. Today, it accounts for 20%. That's explosive growth. But this isn't just about economics. China is advancing on all fronts. Its Belt and Road Initiative, a mega global infrastructure project, has brought investments to over 150 countries. With this, Beijing isn't just building roads and ports, it's gaining strategic allies. At the same time, it has strengthened its role in international organizations and created its own institutions, like the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, which in some cases compete directly with Western ones. What makes this even more interesting is that China isn't just participating in the global system the U.S. designed. It's trying to change it. And this, unsurprisingly, doesn't sit well with Washington. The trade war that began in 2018, sanctions against Chinese companies like Huawei, and restrictions on access to key technology are just a few examples of how this rivalry is intensifying. Now, this doesn't mean we're on the brink of a world war, but we are facing a global realignment that will affect everyone. When two superpowers compete, the rest of the world feels the repercussions. Latin America, Europe, Africa, all are on a chessboard where every move by China and the U.S. has economic and political consequences. The most worrying part is that this shift in the world order doesn't happen in isolation. It intersects with the other two major problems I've mentioned, rising inequality and soaring global debt. For instance, massive debt makes countries more vulnerable to financial crises, which in turn fuels social discontent. Add to that the challenge to the old global order and the fact that many economies depend on Chinese trade and investment, and the outlook becomes even more uncertain. This leaves us with many questions. Are we prepared for this era of change? Will China become the new dominant power, or will there be a balance of forces in the future? One thing is certain. The world is not the same as it was 20 years ago. We are witnessing the birth of a new global order. Great changes bring opportunities, but also enormous challenges. Learning from history. From the Great Depression to the 2008 crisis. For me, history has always been the best teacher. It's not just a collection of dates and figures. It's a story of how decisions, good or bad, affect people's lives. Before the 2008 crisis, I spent hours reading and reflecting on the Great Depression of the 1930s. Back then, people saw how, after years of borrowing without limits, everything collapsed overnight. The accumulated debt became such a heavy burden that the only way out was drastic spending cuts. This meant many families lost their jobs, homes, and, with them, faith in the future. It was an excruciating but necessary adjustment to restore balance. That experience left a mark on me. It taught me that when debt grows unchecked, the system becomes unbalanced, and the consequences are inevitable. When the 2008 crisis hit, many of those same patterns repeated. For years, people had trusted that prices would keep rising and that it was safe to borrow to buy homes and other assets. The housing bubble formed thanks to that excess credit and blind confidence that nothing bad would happen. But as often happens, the house of cards collapsed. Suddenly, millions were jobless, unable to pay their mortgages, and financial markets were left reeling. What I lived through then made me realize that the real economy, the one based on production, job creation, and genuine wealth generation, is what truly matters. Filling balance sheets with numbers and debt is meaningless if, in the end, people don't have jobs or homes. One of the things that has stuck with me most is how both episodes show that past mistakes repeat if we don't learn from them. It's as if history is shouting at us. Look what happens when credit is abused and debt limits are ignored. And despite these clear examples, we keep falling into the same trap over and over. This pains me because instead of learning and changing course, we seem to opt for short-term fixes that only delay the inevitable reckoning. The deleveraging process, reducing excessive debt. Imagine that for years, governments, businesses, and even families borrow without thinking of consequences. Everything goes well as long as the economy grows. But there comes a point when that debt becomes unsustainable, like carrying an ever heavier backpack until you can no longer bear it. That's the situation during the Great Depression, and again in 2008. The system had to slam on the brakes, reduce debt, and unfortunately, that meant a sharp decline in economic activity. No one emerges unscathed from these adjustments. One strategy used to soften these blows is lowering interest rates. The idea is that if loans are cheaper, people can keep accessing credit, and the economy won't grind to a halt. During the 2008 crisis, rate cuts helped ease the situation, at least temporarily. But as we know, when rates hit zero, the so-called zero lower bound, governments are forced to seek other alternatives. This is where massive money printing, quantitative easing, comes in. In the short term, printing money can stimulate the economy, but in the long run, it carries risks like inflation and currency devaluation. It's an emergency measure that, if overused, can create even greater structural problems. Another lesson I've learned is how all this happens in an increasingly interconnected world. In the past, crises were more localized, and their effects were mostly felt in the affected region. Today, however, we live in such a connected planet that a problem in one place, like the 2008 U.S. bank failures, quickly turns into a global crisis impacting countries on every continent. I remember how, back then, people talked about the domino effect. What happened in one place spread uncontrollably to others. This interconnectedness means systemic risk is much higher, and even small disruptions can trigger chain reactions. Moreover, global interconnectedness isn't just economic, it's political too. Sanctions, for example, have become a tool that can affect not just one country, but the entire international financial system. With the geopolitical crisis around the war in Ukraine, we saw how sanctions against Russia created uncertainty in markets and impacted investors worldwide. This made me reflect on how fragile the global balance is and how the decisions of a few can have enormous repercussions for millions. What's clear to me is that the real lesson from the past is that there are no magic solutions or shortcuts to avoiding painful economic cycles. When too much debt accumulates and the limits of what an economy can bear are ignored, a reckoning becomes inevitable. And that reckoning, however painful, always forces us to rethink our priorities. Personally, it frustrates me to see that, despite these clear episodes, we keep repeating the same mistakes. It's as if we refuse to learn from history's lessons. The importance of education and adaptation. One thing I've emphasized throughout my career is the importance of education and adaptability in times of crisis. Those who prepare themselves and learn to understand economic cycles have a significant advantage. Financial literacy and the ability to interpret economic signals are essential tools for navigating uncertainty. I've seen how, in the toughest moments, people who invest in their education and adapt to change don't just survive, they thrive. History is full of examples of societies that, after deep setbacks, reinvented themselves and built new models of growth based on innovation and cooperation. The key is recognizing that the pain of adjustment is, in the long run, an opportunity to build something better. It's not just about waiting out the storm, but learning from it, analyzing what went wrong and preparing for the future. Resilience, both individually and collectively, is a fundamental quality in a world of constant transformation. And it's precisely this ability to adapt that can make the difference between falling into the abyss or emerging with new opportunities. A final warning. In closing, I want to leave you with a clear warning based on my years of experience and deep study of history. We are in a time of great change and accumulated risks that, if not addressed structurally, could lead to a crisis even greater than a mere recession. The massive creation of debt, relentless money printing, social polarization, and the rise of new powers are converging into a scenario that demands a radical rethinking of our economic and political models. This isn't about pessimism. It's about recognizing that the system as we know it is at a crossroads. I don't mean for these words to be a prophecy, but a warning based on decades of experience and rigorous analysis of historical cycles. I know many may be skeptical of what I described, but I firmly believe the only way to prevent crises from becoming catastrophes is to face them with open eyes. We may be on the verge of a new world order, a transformation that redefines how we live, work, and invest. The question is, what will you do about it?